Every few months, Sarah performed the same ritual. She opened the pantry, pulled everything onto the kitchen counter, threw away food she had forgotten existed, wiped the shelves, bought a few new baskets, and carefully put everything back. For about a week, the pantry looked perfect. The pasta stood together. The canned goods formed neat rows. Snacks had their own basket. Baking supplies occupied another shelf. Sarah would open the door just to admire it. Then, ordinary life returned. A new box of cereal was placed in front of an older one. A half-used bag of rice disappeared behind a bulk package. 2 bottles of soy sauce somehow became 3 because nobody remembered the first 2 were there. A can of beans bought for one recipe moved slowly toward the back wall and vanished. By the time Sarah performed the next pantry clean-out, she would discover expired crackers, duplicate sauces, forgotten cans, stale nuts, and enough pasta to feed the family for a month. She always blamed the pantry for being too small. But after seeing how food storage was handled in many Japanese homes, she began to suspect something different. The real problem was not that the pantry needed more space. It was that the food inside it had no system for moving. Sarah had organized the pantry as if it were a photograph. Japanese food storage guidance suggested thinking of it more like a small grocery store. Food comes in. Food moves forward. Food gets eaten. Then and only then replacement food comes in behind it. Once Sarah understood that the pantry stopped being a place where groceries went to disappear, her first change happened before she purchased a single organizer. On Saturday morning, Sarah usually wrote the grocery list from memory. Pasta might be low. Maybe the family needed canned tomatoes. Her husband liked peanut butter, so another jar could not hurt. Rice was on sale and rice lasted forever. The list was built around what she thought the household might need, rather than what it actually had. This time, Sarah opened the pantry first. She checked every shelf. There were 4 boxes of pasta, not 1. 2 unopened jars of peanut butter were hiding behind cereal. She had 6 cans of tomatoes and enough rice for weeks. 1 package of crackers had been opened and forgotten. A bag of flour was approaching the date printed on it. Before entering a supermarket, Sarah removed almost half the pantry items from her shopping list. Nothing had been discounted. She had simply stopped buying groceries she already owned. Japanese food loss guidance encourages households to check refrigerators and food storage areas before shopping, and Sarah immediately saw why the habit mattered. A pantry cannot save money if nobody knows what is inside it. Hidden food behaves almost exactly like missing food. The household buys another one, the older package moves farther backward, and eventually the original purchase becomes waste. Sarah had assumed visibility meant transferring everything into beautiful, matching containers. Social media pantries had trained her well. Clear jars with identical labels looked organized, and she had considered buying dozens of them. But the Japanese idea she borrowed was, simpler food should be arranged so someone can quickly see what exists and how much remains. The container itself was secondary. Sarah grouped pasta with pasta, canned vegetables with canned vegetables, breakfast foods together, baking ingredients together, and frequently used seasonings in another area. The goal was not to create a showroom. It was to reduce search time. When all the canned tomatoes were in one place, Sarah could count them in seconds. When 3 open packages of noodles were scattered across different shelves, inventory required detective work. Putting similar foods together also revealed uncomfortable truths. The family owned 7 kinds of crackers because different boxes had been hiding in different corners. There were duplicate spices and several nearly identical sauces. The pantry had appeared diverse because its duplicates were separated. Once categories were consolidated, Sarah finally understood what the household actually had. But grouping food created another question: where should each category live? Sarah had always used whatever shelf had enough room. A large bag of rice might end up at eye level, while something the family used every morning required bending down and moving 3 boxes. Baking supplies occupied prime real estate despite being used twice a month. Frequently eaten snacks disappeared on a high shelf, while seldom used specialty ingredients sat directly in front. Japanese household stock storage guidance recommends considering purpose and frequency when choosing storage locations, and Sarah borrowed the logic for everyday food. Foods used constantly earned convenient space. Breakfast items moved where everyone could reach them. Everyday cooking staples stayed near the kitchen work area. Less frequently used baking ingredients could tolerate a less convenient shelf. Emergency supplies did not need to compete with tonight's dinner for the easiest location. The difference became obvious within days. Her husband stopped leaving cereal on the counter because returning it no longer required rearranging half the pantry. Sarah's daughter stopped opening a second package of snacks because the open one was visible and easy to reach. Organization was beginning to affect behavior. Then Sarah addressed what she later realized had been the most expensive shelf in the entire pantry. It was the deep shelf, where new food constantly buried old food. Every grocery trip, Sarah placed fresh purchases in the easiest available position, the front. That meant the newest pasta was eaten first, while older pasta slowly moved toward the wall. New cans arrived in front of identical older cans. A fresh jar of sauce blocked another jar approaching its best before date. It was exactly the opposite of how inventory should move. Sarah reversed the direction. New purchases went behind older ones. Older products moved forward. The family did not need labels saying first in, first out. They simply reached for what was already closest. This tiny arrangement turned the pantry into a queue. Food finally had an exit strategy. Dates became more visible too. Sarah had always checked dates when she bought something, but rarely looked again until a pantry cleanout. That made the printed date almost useless. Japanese storage guidance suggests making dates easy to see, including writing them where necessary so stock can be rotated more easily. Sarah did not label every single can. She focused on foods that tended to disappear for long periods. A few dates were written where they could be seen without removing packages. Open products received particular attention. When two identical items existed, the one needing to be used first stayed in front. Suddenly, the family no longer discovered three products simultaneously reaching the end of their useful storage period. Time had become visible. That was when Sarah encountered the Japanese rolling stock idea, and at first it sounded almost too simple to deserve a name. A household keeps a little extra of foods it normally eats. It consumes the older stock in ordinary meals. When something is used, the household buys enough to replace what left. Store, eat, replenish, repeat. Sarah realized how different this was from her existing idea of stocking up. Her version looked like this: see a sale, buy 6. Push them into the pantry, forget how many remain. See another sale, buy 4 more. The quantity moved only in one direction until the shelf was full. Rolling stock required movement in both directions. She tested the system with canned tomatoes, pasta, rice, soup, beans, and several foods the family used regularly. Instead of buying huge quantities whenever the price looked attractive, she decided roughly how much made sense for their normal routine and backup needs. If 2 cans were used, 2 cans could return on the next shopping trip. If no pasta left the pantry that week, there was little reason to bring more home. The pantry stopped expanding simply because supermarkets kept offering sales. This was a major shift for Sarah because she had always associated abundance with security. 10 packages felt safer than 4. But if the household normally used 1 package a week, buying 10 did not necessarily create 10 weeks of useful security. It could also create crowded shelves, forgotten dates, duplicate purchases, and money trapped inside food the family might eventually stop wanting. That led to an even more important rule. The best pantry stock was food the family genuinely ate. Sarah had several emergency products purchased because they seemed responsible. Canned meals nobody liked, unusual protein bars, dry foods requiring preparation the family had never practiced, and specialty items that sounded useful during an emergency but had no role in ordinary life. They sat untouched because eating them felt like wasting emergency supplies. Then years passed, and some eventually became actual waste. Japan's rolling stock approach encourages households to include familiar everyday foods in preparedness, not only special emergency products. Sarah began integrating useful backup food into normal meals. Canned fish the family enjoyed could be eaten and replaced. Instant soup could be used on a busy night. Shelf-stable curry the children liked could become dinner occasionally rather than waiting for a disaster. Emergency preparedness stopped being a separate museum inside the pantry. The household learned what the food tasted like, how to prepare it, and whether anyone would actually want it. Not everything needed to be mixed together, however. Sarah learned that purpose still mattered. Everyday food belonged where it could rotate easily. Less frequently used emergency supplies could occupy another clearly defined area. Heavy items made more sense lower down, while lighter goods could live higher. The point was not to hide emergency food. It was to prevent several different kinds of inventory from becoming one confusing wall of packages. For years, Sarah's pantry had treated everything equally. Tonight's pasta, birthday cake, decorations, camping food, canned emergency meals, and a jar of spices used once a year all competed for the same visual attention. Once purpose was clear, the pantry became much easier to understand. Open packages became Sarah's next target. This was where surprising amounts of food disappeared. A new bag of crackers would be opened because nobody saw the old one. 2 bags of rice could both be partially used. Several boxes of cereal might be opened simultaneously. Nuts became stale because the family kept reaching for newer packages. Sarah created one simple use-first area. Nothing fancy. Opened foods and items that should be finished soon went there when practical. Suddenly, the pantry began giving instructions without anybody making a weekly meal plan. An open package of noodles suggested tomorrow's lunch. Crackers that needed finishing became the obvious snack. A half-used bag of dried fruit was no longer competing with 12 unopened choices. The family did not feel deprived. In fact, deciding what to eat became easier because the pantry contained a visible short list of priorities. Sarah also stopped keeping multiple open versions of the same thing whenever possible. Previously, if her daughter wanted cereal and the preferred box was behind another one, she might open a new box simply because it was easier. If a bag of flour was almost empty, Sarah sometimes started the new one rather than finishing the old package. Individually, these decisions seemed harmless. Collectively, they created a pantry filled with food halfway through its useful life. One open package became the default. The backup waited unopened behind it. This simple habit made freshness easier to manage and quantities easier to understand. The next discovery was uncomfortable because it involved sales. Sarah loved pantry deals precisely because shelf-stable food seemed impossible to waste. 20% off canned soup, buy more. 2 jars for the price of 1, put them in the cart. Pasta at the lowest price of the year, stock up. But the pantry was already full. Money was being converted into inventory simply because a yellow sign created urgency. Consumer guidance in Japan warns against buying unnecessary multi-pack or sale items without a realistic plan to use them. Sarah started imposing a physical limit. Each category received an amount of space. When the pasta section was comfortably full, another sale did not create more room. The shelf became a budget. This rule was much harder than it sounded. A bargain creates the emotional feeling that refusing to buy is losing money. But Sarah finally realized that the household did not save $3 when it spent $12 on food it did not need. Sometimes, the most profitable pantry decision was leaving a discounted product in the store. When space became the limit, sales lost some of their power. The family could still buy more of foods it consumed reliably, but cheap was no longer enough. The product also needed somewhere to go and a realistic path toward being eaten. A small basket near the front of the pantry became Sarah's meal planning assistant. Anything approaching the point where it deserved attention could move there, a can that had been ignored too long. A package purchased for a recipe that never happened. An open bag that needed finishing. A sauce that had plenty of life left but had been forgotten. Before planning the week's meals, Sarah looked at that basket. Dinner occasionally began with the pantry instead of a recipe website. Beans could join soup, pasta could handle one night, a canned ingredient could complete a meal. The family gradually stopped asking what should we buy to cook and started asking what do we already own that could become dinner. That one reversal reduced both food waste and the size of the next grocery trip. It also prevented pantry ingredients from becoming permanent residents. Sarah had once purchased a jar of an unfamiliar sauce for a single recipe. The recipe was successful, but only 2 tablespoons of sauce were used. The jar remained for months because the family did not know what else to do with it. Now, unusual purchases required a second question before entering the cart. How else could this be used? Specialty ingredients were not forbidden, but they needed more than one possible future. A condiment that worked with several meals was easier to justify. A grain that could become both a side dish and part of another recipe made sense. Pantry flexibility mattered for the same reason it mattered with fresh food ingredients. With several possible destinations are less likely to become expensive decorations. Over time, Sarah noticed that the pantry needed much less organizing than before. The family did not perform giant monthly cleanouts because the system constantly exposed problems while they were still small. When one category began overflowing, Sarah could see it immediately. When an open product remained untouched, it stayed visible. When an older can approach the front, it became easier to use. When something left, replacement happened deliberately rather than emotionally. The physical pantry actually contained fewer foods, but it felt more useful. This confused Sarah at first. She had always believed more inventory meant more meal options. In practice, an overloaded pantry had created the illusion of choice. There might be 50 products inside, but 15 were duplicates, 10 were ingredients. Nobody remembered how to use. Several were hidden, and another group had been purchased only because they were discounted. A smaller pantry filled with familiar, visible, flexible ingredients could produce more realistic meals than a larger pantry full of forgotten possibilities. There was another benefit Sarah had not expected. Grocery shopping became faster. Before leaving home, she could scan each category quickly. The household did not need a complicated inventory spreadsheet because the food itself was visible. Pasta section enough. Rice enough. Canned tomatoes, 1 left, add 2. Peanut butter open jar plus 1 backup, no need. Crackers, several packages, absolutely no need. The pantry had become readable. That readability also reduced anxiety. Sarah no longer wondered whether the family was running out of everything. She could see where supplies were strong and where they were actually low. Even emergency preparedness felt calmer because the backup food was circulating rather than quietly aging behind a wall of other groceries. Japanese government guidance describes rolling stock as a way to maintain a consistent household supply by consuming older items and replenishing what has been used. Sarah finally understood the genius of the system. The goal was not maximum stock. The goal was stable stock. Those are very different ideas. Maximum stock asks how much can fit. Stable stock asks how much the household actually needs to maintain. Maximum stock loves sales. Stable stock notices consumption. Maximum stock keeps adding. Stable stock moves. By the end of the year, Sarah's pantry did not resemble the perfectly staged kitchens she had once saved on her phone. There were original packages. Some baskets did not match. A handwritten date appeared on a few boxes. Rice stayed in the container the family already owned. Cans were arranged for visibility rather than visual symmetry. Nothing about it would impress a professional stylist. But every shelf worked. Foods with the same purpose lived together. Frequently used ingredients were easy to reach. Older products stood in front of newer replacements. Dates were visible when they mattered. Opened packages had priority. Backup quantities had limits. Emergency foods actually belonged to the family's normal diet. New purchases entered only after the household checked what was already there. And once a week, meals were partly shaped by foods that needed to move. Sarah had finally stopped organizing the pantry as a storage problem. It was a flow problem. Food is not supposed to enter a pantry and stay there. It is supposed to enter, wait for a reasonable amount of time, become a meal, and leave. Everything else, from visible storage to rolling stock to keeping older food in front, is simply a way of protecting that movement. The biggest lesson was almost embarrassingly simple. Kitchen waste often begins long before food is thrown into the trash. It begins when a can disappears behind another can, when 2 open packages compete with each other, when a sale convinces someone to buy a 5th item before the first 4 are used, when emergency food becomes too precious to eat until it is too old to enjoy, when the pantry becomes so full that the household can no longer see what it owns. Sarah had spent years trying to solve those problems with more containers. What she needed was fewer mysteries. Now, before something enters her cart, she can picture where it will go. Before new food enters the pantry, older food moves forward. Before planning a grocery trip, she checks what is already available. Before an unusual ingredient comes home, it needs more than one possible use. And before a sale creates urgency, the pantry gets the final vote. That does not eliminate every ounce of waste. No real household operates perfectly. A forgotten package still happens. Plans change. Someone stops liking a food the week after a multi-pack comes home. But waste is no longer built into the system. And that may be the most useful Japanese pantry lesson of all. The best organized pantry is not necessarily the one that holds the most food, uses the most containers, or looks beautiful when the door opens. It is the one where almost everything inside is visible, understood, rotated, and eventually eaten. Because a pantry is not supposed to prove how much food a household owns. It is supposed to help that food become dinner.